Thank you. I'm going to move over to Animal Justice Party, the Honourable Mark Pearson.
Chair, thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.
Just if you were to step back and look at the dairy industry objectively and its viability, the lack of, at the moment, as you said, of good leadership, and then also look at the factors of climate change, the environment of Australia. Has it ever been considered by Norco or by the dairy industry, or to actually maybe move away from animal-based milks towards plant-based milks, using the same land, the same properties that the dairies are built on and that they're thriving on, or not thriving in this case? Has it ever been considered that maybe it might be wise or good advice to start to move towards a plant-based milk industry, though we can't really use that word legally, I don't think, considering that it is actually flourishing, the plant-based products?
I think we sell milks that are plant-based. So in our distribution model, we sell, if a customer would like a plant-based milk product, then that's the choice that we provide. So we're not opposed to plant-based products, but the definitive answer to your question is no, we haven't actually encouraged farmers to go down the path of planting pecan trees or almond trees to actually produce a milk-style product. So,
I mean, considering, what we're hearing is that, in a sense, the dairy industry is in crisis, and whether that actually would be a wise advice. I suppose that's just the question I'm asking.
Well,
but obviously it's not being. Norco hasn't turned their mind to that.
Well, I think it's about a diversity of income streams that actually allows you to survive. So it may not be a complete. The reality is, Norco wouldn't survive under that model because not enough consumers have moved down to that path. Yes, there's an increasing consumer sentiment that would prefer to drink a plant-based product, which is fine. But it's not a big enough industry to support 200 farmers at this point in time. And that evolution process may take 10 to 15 years. Planting a tree and harvesting the plant-based material for that may take a significant time.
Okay, thanks for that. Yep. Mr. Thompson, you were talking about, it's a bit more sort of personal as to what you did, but I think it might be a good example. You packed up from the coast and moved to Cowra and invested in a dairy there, at a time when the dairy industry's future was in question, in terms of it being a viable economy for anybody who was investing. Was that a risk that other dairy farmers are taking? How did you assess that risk?
I saw everyone saw deregulation in a different way. I saw it as an opportunity. Under regulation, we had quota system, but those quota systems tied up a lot of capital on dairy farms. Under deregulation, the system was, we had our compensation package. Some farmers chose to take that compensation and exit the industry with dignity. I saw still potential in the dairy industry, and particularly inland New South Wales, and so I chose to relocate to Cowra in the Central West and start a new facility, start a completely different style of dairy farming to the traditional pasture-based farming in a freestall dairy. Since that time, or probably during that time, some of the issues that I came up against were, took actually 7 years to get approval. There was 3 court cases in the Land Environment Court. It really highlighted a lack, or the lack of planning in New South Wales for dairy farms in inland. But since that time, we have developed a completely new system. We have regularly other farmers visiting our system. I had to go offshore. I had to go to the US to get expertise to learn how to develop this new system, and it's a system that it has great potential to grow and make our New South Wales industry more sustainable.
An intensive system?
It is an intensive system, absolutely. So, yes, there was a risk. I do remember going to 4 banks to get finance. 3 of them said no, and 1 said yes, I'll give it a go, so we went.
Thank you. Mr. Pearson?
Yep, thank you, Chair. Mr. Hanson, you said that when there have been situations where, in areas where there's been an oversupply of milk, that's had a critical effect on the pricing. But then you said because of integration, that it's taken the valve off that particular problem in that area where there's an oversupply. Can you explain how that actually has happened?
So I guess that's just a reflection of the fact that with our hygiene standards, our food transport standards and the logistics chains that are now in place, milk is not as geographically isolated, fresh milk is not as geographically isolated as once was, and is hence able to be transported to fill holes in other markets if there's suppliers in some.
Right, okay. That was clarified. Mr. Russell, at what point does a typical dairy become an intensive dairy, and what factors are brought to bear on a dairy to move in that direction?
I think it's actually quite, thanks for the question, Mr. Pearson. I think it's actually quite difficult to define a particular dairy as being intensive or otherwise. I guess the thing about dairying is that it requires a really high level of management input, and for me that's what defines it as an intensive production system, the fact that it does require that high level of management input. There are different production systems in Australia, and some of those involved either, we call them a partial mixed ration production system or a total mixed ration production system, and that reflects how much time the animals spend on pasture compared with being fed from a trough, say. But really, I see them as an intensive industry because of that high level of management input that makes it quite challenging from the farmer's point of view.
It's not because of the amount of space per the density, stocking density. It's more a matter of the amount of the intensity of the work by people. That's my view, and the inputs that are provided. So the less time the animals spend on pasture, the more there is a requirement to cut and conserve forage and bring that to the cattle, or to spend money on buying inputs, grain and fodder. I think there was a period of time where, I don't know whether we're still doing it as much, but exporting dairy cattle as breeding stock, I think mainly to Asia, perhaps to the Middle East. Is that continuing? And if it is it having an impact on the economics of the dairy industry in Australia in terms of our exports of dairy?
I think there continues to be, not at the rates of what they might have in previous years, but continues to be a high-end valued dairy heifer air shipment into Asian markets that are looking to grow their own genetics and their own herds. Mm-hmm. But some of the speakers after us might be better placed to sort of talk on that front. Mm-hmm. What we are seeing, though, is a significant increase in the integration between dairy operations and the meat operations as well, in terms of the opportunity of supplying calves into beef production systems. And that's largely because we've seen, exacerbated by the last 12 months, but a significant reduction in the national herd, whilst there's incredible demand for meat globally continuing to grow. And so, dairy farmers, while focusing on the purpose of producing milk, obviously have both opportunities with the animals they're producing in terms of the meat industry, as well as with the fodder they're producing in terms of that fodder being a potential source of income in terms of if they're able to produce surplus to requirements, which the last 12 months hasn't been the case. But dairy farmers are very good at looking at that business integration, looking at how they maximise the resources they have available to them to make their business as sustainable as possible.